I'm actually very, very honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Tereza Hendl. But rather than giving you a summary put together by an AI-powered search engine, which everyone can do, I will narrate how I stumbled upon Tereza. So I came across her article published exactly a year ago now, entitled "Can Digital Health Democratize Healthcare?" And it was published in the Journal of Bioethics. And in this paper, she and Ayush Shukla argued that the discourse of democratization is primarily framed around individual empowerment rather than addressing systemic inequities in healthcare. It resonated with our group's conclusion that the quality improvement and patient safety movements have not delivered what they sought to achieve because they are not anchored in the pursuit of health equity. Healthcare differs from the aviation industry in that when a plane crashes, some passengers have parachutes. Some even have self-driving jets. So not everyone dies. And this is why I always say that rather than pattern healthcare into aviation industry, I think ours is going to be a little bit different, because in a real life plane crash, I think that the likelihood of people dying will be the same, but not in healthcare. If the healthcare enterprise continues to break down, not everyone is going to suffer the consequence. Some people are going to be very much padded by all the privilege that they have. To design quality improvement and patient safety initiatives without appreciating the heterogeneity of risk is not only being reductive or narrow-minded, it's simply blind. We invited Tereza to speak today. Oh, no. After meeting her, we invited her to speak to our global network of learners last spring, which she graciously accepted. And since then, we've had numerous Zoom calls in the context of a paper we wrote on the common myths of meritocracy, in particular, those that masquerade privilege as merit. Fast forward to the day I'm meeting Tereza for the first time in person after flying 10,000 miles or 16,000 kilometers from Sydney yesterday, and after almost being derailed by the discovery of a body part in the plane that she boarded in Houston. We don't know what that body part is. She finally made it to provide a ushering of this hopefully new age in education. Tereza, thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? Oh, yes. I'll try to split it up. Okay, perfect. This should be better, yeah? Fantastic. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much to the organizers for having me. It was an achievement to get here, and I'm very happy to be here with you all. And I told Leo when I was invited that I will try to find some words that would express what it means to actually be opening an event that is dedicated to the memory of Martin Luther King. It was very hard to find them because it's a huge honor. I obviously do not have a direct relation to the Black liberation struggle that he led. I also come from a very different socio-historical context. I grew up in what was then Czechoslovakia, that was still under a Soviet military occupation when I was a child. And I come from quite a politically minded family, and it was my grandfather who actually told me about Martin Luther King when I still was very young. So in my mind, he was present since a very early age as a reference point, as a symbol of striving for justice. And that was something that I could relate to. And I flew from Sydney. I'm just trying to move this, yes. And where I used to live and work for almost a decade at Sydney Health Ethics. And when I would walk from Sydney Uni back home, this was a mural that I passed by every single day. And it was like a meditation for me. And what you see in here is an integration of I Have a Dream with First Nations striving for justice. So you see under the portrait an Aboriginal flag, a First Nation flag, and I have to say that First Nations in Australia do claim the term Aboriginal for themselves. That was critiqued in other contexts, otherwise I wouldn't be using it. And in the enlarged part of that mural, you see we have the dreaming. And this is a reference to Dreamtime that in First Nations actually represents the beginning of time. When a life origins, where it was created. And so it's this integration of these struggles for justice that are very also felt in Australia. This is on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Sydney. And indeed, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures are some of the oldest on Earth. They're around 60,000 years old. And yet, these approaches have very rarely entered a canon of debates on health, well-being, and justice, despite of them being really the first original cultures on this land. And they come with very specific approaches to healthcare, to ethics, to digital technologies as well. And their absence in our debates, I think, should concern us, because these are also the perspectives of some of the most systematically harmed communities. And while I was in Australia, I was trying to finish a book that will be coming out hopefully soon with OUP. It's an edited volume on mHealth and intersectional ethics for global society that we're putting together with my colleagues, sociologist Bianca Jansky, public health ethicist Verna Wild, and Pael Aura, who's a humanities scholar, digital humanities scholar. And the idea was to platform in the book the perspectives of communities that have been underrepresented and underserved. And so we have several chapters in there that, for example, address concerns of indigenous data sovereignty from Maori perspectives from Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I conducted an interview with Azur Hermes, who talks about genomics and digitization from Aboriginal perspectives in Australia. And then there will be also a chapter by Keisha Ray, who has done so much work on Black health and bioethics here in the US. So I want to just tell you that this will be coming out soon, and it will be in open access because we really wanted, we had just discussion about how difficult it is to access some of these discussions, also by communities who have been systemically disadvantaged because they're locked behind paywalls, and so people can access some very crucial debates about their own concerns of health justice. So we made the point of making this accessible anywhere around the world. And it's a result of a 6 years long project on mobile health and its ethical, social, and legal aspects. And so in this talk, I want to share some ideas and observations that we made during these 6 years when we were looking at digital health. And leave you hopefully with some food for thought. This work comes mostly from philosophy and ethics and sociology, and I imagine that in the room there are people who are also looking at digital health and AI from so many different disciplines and fields, so I will be really interested also hearing your feedback and questions, and I look forward to the discussion at the end. So in the project, we observed how much hype there has been about digital health and its revolutionary potential to transform human health and worldwide and achieve higher standards of health. This was very much shared, an optimism shared by some global health agencies such as WHO and European Commission, and there has been a lot of hopes and expectations about how digital health will be the thing that will also give people access to healthcare and improve its quality. And we know that there is evidence of some improvements. For example, I saw some studies that show that for example, health apps can help people quit smoking, and they're really important in certain rehabilitation therapies, such as for breast cancers. So we have some empirical evidence that in some areas they work. But at the same time, we have a growing pool of evidence that they do not facilitate equitable health outcomes. There's a growing pool of evidence that a variety of digital health technologies reinforce inequalities, and they also come short of providing rigorous health information and equitable health services. They have very often not been trained on heterogeneous data and are thus not serving whole population groups, and subsequently, many are not suitable for use across the whole population or globally. Many studies have in particular shown that AI platforms are commonly trained with data skewed towards a partial segment of the population, and as a consequence, they deliver poor, false, and potentially harmful results. So, for example, a large recent study shows that AI systems working with medical imaging data sets fail to deliver correct diagnosis in women owing to the overrepresentation of male data in publicly available X-ray image databases, and deep neural network architectures. And some scholars have argued that a consistent decrease in performance is observed when using male patients for training and female for testing, and vice versa. So we have this evidence that technologies produce inequitable health outcomes and replicate inequalities, which should concern us from a perspective of health justice. And in much of global health justice philosophy, health justice is considered a major goal of healthcare. And throughout our research project, we have also argued that while many health technologies might not market themselves as medical or diagnostic devices, they nevertheless offer health guidance and services and are part of healthcare systems, and thus should follow some standards of health equity and justice, as well as safety, efficacy, and health benefit, just like standard healthcare. But we keep coming across studies that show the inequities and disparities that are magnified by digital health. So this is often an issue of training data. We know, for example, from different studies that Black Americans with sickle cell anemia are overdiagnosed, and this will get magnified when you automate diagnosis. And I don't know if you're familiar with this example, but this is a recent Google dermatology app that was introduced without a clinical trial and was vastly tested and trained on white skin, and therefore it will overdiagnose or fail to diagnose people with darker skin tones. And despite of this major disparity, it was certified as Class 1 app in the EU. So for us in Europe, it also raises a lot of concerns about how do we certify these devices and with what criteria. We also see that sometimes the distortion in the data begins at the clinic and continues throughout the healthcare referral process. So we know there's research on the implications on skewed data sets in mammography screening that shows that clinicians tend to spend less time with negatively racialized and socioeconomically disadvantaged women. And these groups of women then may not be referred to specialists, and their diagnostic images will not reach into the data sets that are used to train machine learning systems. And the absence of the training data then likely will have a disproportionate detrimental impact on the very same population groups, as conditions that might be population-specific or more prevalent in particular groups, including owing to social economic deprivation, will not be documented and might be harder to detect, and this effect will likely be magnified, again, through processes such as algorithmic bias and discrimination. And these issues thus point at intersectional inequalities and injustices, whereby several layers of structural disadvantage intersect and generate specific and often magnified patterns of discrimination and produce inequitable, unjust health outcomes. And in my thinking on intersectionality, I built on, in particular, on Black feminist conceptualizations by Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins. Many of you will also be familiar with the pulse oximetry issue. Is there anyone who isn't? Because maybe I'm saying something that you're all familiar with. You all are? Okay. So this was a major problem during the COVID-19 pandemic when patients were triaged. And again, it's an example of another technology that very likely has cost lives because people were deprived access to healthcare. And we have more and more examples that this has been a major problem in AI. Some of these examples also point at problems with black box kind of design when we don't know what is happening. And this was a case of an algorithm that was very troubling and depriving, again, a lot of people of access to healthcare. And nobody knew exactly why. And then studies showed that the algorithm did not exactly look at people's diagnosis, but was inferring diagnosis from information about health spending. And we know that people who are socioeconomically deprived and racialized are not referred to specialists, and therefore they have lower spending in healthcare, right? And so this will get, again, magnified through algorithmic discrimination, and you end up with a major problem. I will say just a few words also about epistemic injustice. We have a lot of technologies such as digital health and apps when you have tracing technologies and you use mobile applications, they often come with certain choices and certain frameworks, right? And it's very questionable what happens when your experiences do not match the kind of framework that you are given, or you have different symptoms, or you have different bodily experiences. How do these technologies then deal with this kind of variation or difference? Do they enable you to log them? How do they treat your own knowledge? And we basically argue in this paper that looking at femtech, sort of technologies marketed to advance female health, that they often treat digitally generated knowledge as more reliable than your own. And at times it's very troubling because they can really overwrite very important experiences. And there's a long legacy of medicine and healthcare discounting women's experiences, and also particularly women's experiences of pain. And this, again, is magnified in racialized women. We also say in this paper that a lot of technology is very gender binary. It assumes very specific gendered and sex bodies, and for the most part, femtech ignores, for example, transgender users. And we also argue that this is epistemic injustice in itself, and we raise issues with this technology. And last but not least, a lot of concerns of epistemic justice have been raised by indigenous thinkers and doers in the healthcare context. There is a major exclusion and often near erasure of indigenous approaches to health, ethics, and justice in debates and technologies, which subsequently translates into a lack of trauma-informed approaches to the health of some of the most historically oppressed and underserved communities, who have raised also concerns with legacies of colonialism, and also the lack of understanding of concerns of agency and ways to remedy past harm. So I would recommend this article on We Have Gifted Enough, that raises issues with some very dominant ideas in digital health and AI, that, for example, the more we share, the better, because there are communities who have historically been harmed who do not want to share their data, or want to share them under very specific circumstances. And this is what works on indigenous data sovereignty have been exploring. And I conducted an interview with Azur Hermes, who actually gave a very powerful account of some of these past wrongdoings in Australia, where blood was drawn from indigenous children without their context, without their consent, and without guardians, without their parents who could protect them. And that was used for genomics and for research for many years. And then she found out and put a stop to that reuse and recycling and research, and actually went to the people whose samples were taken and had discussions with each and every one of them when they were still alive about what to do with the data and what they want to do with it, and how to prevent this harm being practiced in the future and replicated. And it's a really interesting perspective that I hope that you will be soon able to read. So overall, we have a lot of evidence of harm and inequity, and I find it even more alarming because we simultaneously have a very little pool of evidence that would prove that digital health and AI is capable of producing equitable results. So I would also want to say that we need to sometimes shift the kind of burden of evidence and proof. When we have these often discussions that assume that these technologies are even capable of doing that, I would want to see more proof of empirical evidence that shows so that we can believe this. There is still the stage when we even have a lack of empirical evidence that they're actually efficient for what they're doing, not only that they can produce equitable results. So it's still that very early stage where we are, despite of a lot of the hype that we have seen. So we have asked on my project, how do we actually, how can we come up with some technologies that would stand a chance of producing equitable and just outcomes? And we started thinking about them as transformative technology, as something that can actually positively transform health. And I think that if we want to get onto that path and get closer to some just technology, we need to ask a lot of questions about who designs digital health and AI. There is a major problem that a lot of sociologists discussed as an issue of I methodology, that people who are in tech industry tend to design technologies as if they were working for them. So they imagine themselves as the end user. But we know that this one mold really does not fit all, and we need to overcome this kind of thinking. And I appreciate in this book on invisible women, Caroline Perez actually says that the disparity, when you have a disparity in a tech team, that in itself is a data gap, because you do not have some people's experiences, some lived experiences, some social positions, some health concerns are not there, they're not represented, and the technologies often end up as not being able to address them or even imagine them. So we should start thinking about the composition of these teams also in terms of data gaps, and really do a lot to fix these data gaps in the people that we invite, and also to leadership positions, which often doesn't happen. So they're not just there as someone who sits in the room, but they actually have some power to make decisions and decide on what will be researched and how. And we have recently, on my project, also asked ourselves whether open source can fix something. This has often been presented as a solution, as a viable solution, that you have technologies that can be basically designed by patient communities, which in theory, anyone can be part of them, right? Anyone can innovate. That was very often the rhetoric. And these open source technologies were often presented as a bottom-up kind of innovation. And we had a look at looping systems for TI, type 1 diabetes. And my colleague, Bianca Jansky, actually conducted an empirical study on this. And interestingly, she found out that the German community was very prolific in that innovation space. For some reason, there are a lot of patient innovators in the type 1 diabetes space globally in Germany. And therefore, their sort of innovation and experiences have major impact globally because others then can access the results of the innovation. And so we are not quite sure, for example, whose experiences, or there are a lot of questions about whose experiences are excluded and do not get to shape this type of patient innovation. And our colleague, Azaki Venotsanda, when we were writing this, was actually raising a lot of very justified concerns whether this technology would be safe for example, for her mother who lives with type 1 diabetes in post-apartheid South Africa as a Black woman. And she was really inviting us to think hard about whether the results of this innovation she could effectively and safely use. And this is a really life-saving technology that helps you understand how much insulin should you use and when. So this is quite serious health concern. And when we were writing this paper, and I want to share this as an experience of our own journey with epistemic humility, because we wrote the first draft really looking at access to innovation as a problem in itself, because we noted that to be able to innovate, you actually need to have access to this technology, and this technology is very expensive. So you likely have to be in a system, you need to have insurance, and you need to have an insurer that will reimburse you for being able to get hold of this technology, which basically excludes almost the majority of the world. So that's an issue in itself. This is not a bottom-up kind of innovation, because to be able to innovate, you already have to have a proximity to socioeconomic privilege and power. And then the innovation itself is a very time-demanding process. So again, you have to be quite socioeconomically well off to be able to even have the time to innovate. And again, that narrows down the portion of people who can do this. So we wrote the first draft that was very critical of these issues from the perspective of justice. And then we asked patient innovators and experts on TI1 diabetes and carers for people, for youth with type 1 diabetes, for some feedback. And they actually told us that the draft was almost too critical and reminded us that these are really, really life-saving technologies that they really, really appreciate. So we went back to the draft and we tried to find some kind of balance, some kind of way that will account for all of this. And I think that this, for me, I keep thinking about how do we also do the kind of research that is able to grasp that kind of complexity, because the negatives don't cancel the positives and vice versa. So you have real advantages from technology, and most of the technology that I looked at critically, it offers health benefits to someone, but it fails to offer health benefits to a lot of other people, and these things coexist at the same time. They don't kind of balance each other completely. And then, so how do we conduct the kind of research that is able to account for this and problematize the very alarming lack of health justice in these technologies? And this is something that I still carry on from this research. And I'm trying to think about how to do this kind of more complex work. And if I was to do this again, I think we would also want to have expertise from people with TID diabetes with us from the very beginning. And we would want to have a co-author on the paper who would lead it with us, because we really were humbled by these experiences, and they invited us to think about also just physically what it means to have chronic illness and what it means for us that we do not have these kind of challenges in our everyday life. And that really is a major difference, right? If you have access to something that can be life-saving and life-improving technology and not, makes a difference in that way that we maybe were not able to account for at the beginning. So for me, this really raises a lot of concerns about the importance of integrating expertise from people who actually live with the conditions that we're writing about. And we really ask ourselves also when we look at different digital health technologies and AI, to whose health benefit they work, and where are the gaps? I always, when I present on this, I sound very critical of a lot of technologies, and this is also, I think, the character of my work as an ethicist, that you look at the problems that you want to fix. But I'm just constantly seeing a huge gap and opportunity at the same time, where we need to put more thinking into who are the communities and population groups who are currently structurally vulnerable, who are underserved. And again, it makes a difference who the teams are and whose kind of perspectives are not seen and whose epistemologies are not seen. And this is perhaps also a threshold that we need to change, because right now, a lot of digital health and AI is designed in a way that it tends to benefit people who are socioeconomically better off. And yet, in my field, in health justice, we might want to argue that the people who are actually vulnerable and disadvantaged are the ones whose health needs most improvement, right? Because it's the health that is actually often most kind of detrimentally affected by socioeconomic disadvantage and lack of access to good health services. So we might want to move that threshold of whose health are we actually aiming at? Who is the target group that we need to think about most when it comes to digital health and AI? And shift our thinking in that direction. And we particularly need to worry about the health concerns and epistemologies of some of the most vulnerable and systematically harmed communities. So I was starting with acknowledging that indigenous perspectives on health are often erased from debates. And at the same time, there's also, there are more and more examples of indigenous technologies designed for indigenous communities, and some of them are really interesting. And this image on the left is relating to a really incredible app that indigenous women from some of the most remote communities in South Australia designed for meditation and mindfulness. And they designed it in indigenous languages and with trauma-informed approach. So this is an incredible example of good practice. And on the right, you see my colleague Tiara Roxanne, who is an indigenous cyber feminist with whom I collaborated. And they're currently working for Data in Society and developing trustworthy infrastructures and protocols of trust and safety online with indigenous communities based in Central and South America. And I want you to know about this work because soon there will be some results which will be relevant for digital technologies and AI more broadly, but I imagine that this will be very relevant to healthcare. And I really look forward for what they will come up with. We worked together a few years ago on digital surveillance in the COVID-19 pandemic, trying to imagine what tracing technologies for COVID would look like if they were designed by indigenous communities and following the kind of requirements of indigenous data sovereignty. So this is the work that came out of that collaboration that you're welcome to look into if you want to take a look more into what such technologies might look like. And we talk a lot about agency in that respect, and the ability to actually shape digital health innovation, building on requirements of indigenous data sovereignty. And I'm moving towards the end of the talk. Just wanted to acknowledge that we also need to put more thinking into the regulation of AI. And I'm not a legal scholar. I'm hoping that there are people who are closer to policy and law in this room. So this is really something that is for others to think harder on. But I reflected on the fact that during my career, I looked at health justice in a variety of sort of subfields of medicine and healthcare. And I looked at IVF, I looked at stem cell therapies and digital health and AI. And in all these fields that I was looking at, there was so much hope in self-regulation, that the industry somehow will come up with a way to regulate itself because demand and so on, that users will push for some change, and the providers will somehow respond to those pushes. And it never seemed to work, I have to say, looking at the fields. And I think it's also irresponsible to outsource that kind of work on patients and users, because they often have so many health challenges to attend to, and we should not outsource this kind of work onto them as a burden. It should be the providers, really, who should have some kind of responsibility for providing technologies and healthcare and services that do not harm people or do not facilitate vastly unequal results. That's one thing that I would want to say. And also, of course, without any kind of regulation and without effective sort of push from the industry, this will not happen, because clinical trials, for example, are very costly. So unless someone will have to, as a criteria, for example, of medical certification, unless they will be required to conduct them, and they will be required to think about benefit intersectionally and not just through one skewed lens, they will not, because it's more difficult and it's more costly. So really there needs to be some kind of system that will motivate them, and there will need to be some kind of enforcement, and there will be some kind of consequences for failing to do this. So this is what I would give people who are in policy, and I'm hoping that some of you can address this in your own segments of debates. We also need to think about environmental impact of some of these technologies. And again, this is not the sort of forte of my expertise, but there will be a really good chapter in the book that we're preparing by Gabriel Samuel, who looks into environmental impact and justice, because a lot of these technologies have detrimental environmental impact, and that in turn impacts our health, right, and well-being in this world. So we need to somehow balance the increasing push towards digitization with what it does to the world and to human health, and how to move forward and make sure that this is not distractive and has some kind of sustainability. And at the very end, I just want to say that in the 6 years that I've been working on this, what I've really appreciated is interdisciplinarity, because the way that we think about digital health and AI, you cannot actually get hold of the full picture if you're looking at it just from one kind of discipline or subfield. So I would really want to emphasize that our discussions need to be had across disciplines and in really wide collaborations with people who are in a breadth of fields and hold a breadth of expertise. You might have also noticed that most of the sources that I used in this presentation do not come from philosophy or bioethics, because my own field doesn't have a very good way of relating to material reality. Philosophy actually sucks at it very much. It can absolutely theorize something with being disconnected from lived experiences. And I think that's a major problem that I see with my own discipline and the debates that are in it, because they can be very, not just disconnected, they can disregard a lot of injustice in this world, because the people also who are in the discipline are already in some proximity that enables them to be disconnected from those injustices. And I see that on an everyday basis. So I really try hard to look beyond the discipline and actually do some kind of research that is informed by empirical evidence and material reality. And I think this is really important for me. So this is at the very end where I am grateful that you listened to this talk, and I want to know your feedback or questions, or I'm hoping that it gave you some food for thought and you can take it further. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a few minutes for question and answer, and that can also continue during the... Okay, I'm going to repeat that. We have 9 more minutes for question and answer, and we can also continue that during the break that follows this session. I'm going to start here, over there. And also, Amelia, if you have a question, you could text me, because I know you're listening in Germany. Introduce yourself, and then your question, please.
Hello, my name is Johnny, and I'm MIT affiliated. I just wanted to start by saying thank you for your time and your wonderful presentation. It is really appreciated and informative. I thought I would just ask maybe a bit more of a foundational question, since this is something I'm unfamiliar with. Could you maybe give a quick definition of epistemic justice or epistemic injustice, and then operationalize that within a context, just to maybe a bit more drive home what the overarching theme of the presentation was? That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, so epistemic justice in epistemology would be sort of approached as being seen as a knower. And so if you face epistemic injustice, you are being denied in your capacity of a knower. And that can happen, for example, in a situation when you belong to a group of people who have faced discrimination, and you are not trusted in your experience. And this very often has been raised by, for example, feminist bioethicists in response to how women's experiences with our bodies and pain, for example, have been discounted in the history of medicine and healthcare. So you would not be trusted that you have certain experience, or that like your pain is serious. And for example, you would be denied access to healthcare on these grounds. And there's a lot of research that has problematized this. Does that help?
Okay, next, please.
Hi, thank you so much. I echo everything Johnny said. Thank you for the incredible talk. I'm curious to know how studying ethics and how being an ethicist has informed the way you see the world and the way you go through your daily life now.
Wow, thank you so much for the question. It's a big one. I mean, in so many ways, and I will not lie to you, being an ethicist makes my daily life harder because I see problems that I cannot unsee. So that's a bit of a, you know, you're always the kind of person who makes fuss about something. And that is not always also appreciated. So there's that. But I see also, like, you care about a lot of things that, you know, not everybody necessarily cares about, and I embrace that kind of issue. You also see solutions that you study, right? You engage with ethics, and you get to read a lot of literature that has a different threshold of care about, for example, sustainability. So I try to kind of live that in my life, and I also often am trying to be the kind of change that you want to see in the world, right? That like, and not, of course, everyone, it's not that easy for everyone to be that, because I also don't want to, as Leo was saying, that, outsource this responsibility on an individual, because we're talking about structural and systemic problems, and they they cannot be solved by individualistic solutions, right? We need systemic and structural solutions, but like the way that you see the problems is a good start, and that one raises them and demands some kind of solutions is something that I hope can contribute to, some push for the better. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Vishala. Thank you so much for this talk. This was a great start to the morning. My question, I'm going to try to play a contrarian opinion. I'm a physician by training, and a lot about the post-AI world, as Leo says, worries me. But so my question to you is, let us assume that we don't have the power to go back to a pre-AI world, right? In this post-AI world, what can we do to promote, what can we do while continuing this discourse? What can we do that's within our power, to make sure that this power is wielded in an equitable way? I mean, I'm thinking of certain things. So I mean, the language, for example, that's been the focus of my research. Like, language is a determinant of health, is something that I believe. Language access is very important. If people don't have access to information in their own language, and currently we don't have the resources to do it without AI. And so that's one thing that I'm thinking of, for example. So what can we do? It's a long-winded way of asking a question.
So first of all, I would not want to say that we want or should go to a pre-AI world, because that's also not possible, right? Like that world. And I think I don't come across many people who would argue that, actually. That's one thing. But I hope, for example, in the paper that we wrote on TID, TI1 type diabetes innovation, towards the end of the paper, we are looking at different initiatives and examples of good practice in the open source innovation space, and how they, for example, foster the participation of underserved communities. And so if you go into that piece of writing, this is one kind of source where we are really trying to show some projects and initiatives that have improved that space. So there are absolutely initiatives that are out there that are doing really interesting things to make sure that equity and equitable health outcomes are fostered, right? And I absolutely want to believe that this is possible. So I think that really thinking about some of the questions of who innovates, to whose benefit, and how could train us to really be more mindful about the fact that these inequities exist, right? Because I see, for me, a lot of the problem is that, like, in bioethics and debates on digital health, in my kind of corner of debates, I still come across a lot of discussions that are had from a position of just like assuming that these technologies could do good, and they don't. We have this clear empirical evidence that they come short of that, right? And so, not assuming that anymore, and actually shifting this kind of approach, knowing that they produce unequal results, could be a shift, right? So that we enter those debates with a different kind of mindset, and actually from the beginning are trying to design technologies that will be more likely to produce better results. And I think this is what we can do. I don't see that still done very often, right? So this surprises me, because we have, like, when I think about it, we have like 50, 60 years of a lot of research that is saying the same thing, that innovation in whole different fields produces unequal outcomes, right? But I still walk into a room, for example, at Biotech's conference, and everyone again starts from scratch, assuming that something will be able to facilitate health equity. And I think if we enter that room and already counted with the fact that this is an unequal world and we're designing technologies for it, and therefore we need to design technologies that will intervene into that non-ideal reality in a different way, this is what we can do. And I think we will get really better results.
We'll take one last question, and we will have the whole day to ask to bamboozle Tereza with questions.
Hi. Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi. My name is Allison Bergstrom. I have a very specific question that is concerning a real case study that occurs now at Harvard Medical School in Boston Children's Hospital, and it involves minor children. And it is a serious ethical question, and it is really based off of your lovely question, because you said that like a lot of people don't like to hear what you have to say when you see it. So I was teaching at Boston Children's Hospital, or 25,000 employees, how to use AI, ChatGPT-4, LLMs every day in a secure network. And it was wonderful, right? So we have doctors that are using it to summarize and fight appeals for insurances, and it's great. However, in reality, we have a lot of inequity. What occurs is if you have a toddler, a 2-year-old, who a nurse comes in to do an IV and to do all these tests, and it's very painful, and we all know that behavior is communication. So that toddler acts out, and the nurse goes and writes in the notes that the child was aggressive. That child is then later nonverbal and is 7 years old and goes in to see the doctor, something doesn't go well. And again, a negative connotation word is used on this child. So throughout the lifetime of this child, going all the way up to 18, now if you use an LLM to summarize this child, they have a lot of negative words that people such as nurses and doctors and providers have written in there. So I will call a meeting, and let's all have a meeting with this LLM, and let's all discuss the fact that we need to eliminate these certain words, such as aggression, these types of things. And everyone decides that we're going to change that word to non-compliant. So from here on out, every time you see a word like this, it is going to now be written into the algorithm that it will be non-compliant. So now we have an issue, and I know this because my daughter is a Make-A-Wish child and is in heart failure and is about to turn 18 and has had 25 surgeries, 3 open hearts. One of the most important things when someone goes from pediatrics into adulthood and they may need an organ transplant is that there is a very, very difficult anti-rejection medication regimen that they have to take. And the first question that will determine where you are on, if you are listed as a 1A for a transplant, is this person able to be compliant with this medical prescription regimen? So now when LLM comes in and it looks at the history of the chart and it goes and it summarizes, how many times is it listed now as non-compliant? And I foresee that this will cause now these lovely, amazing, wonderful, deserving children to grow up and now have non-compliant as the main word that is listed. And of course, a nurse should never have written aggressive, and their doctor should never have written another negative word at age 7, but they do. How is it that we can counter that, besides bringing it up to the CEO and the board of trustees and then getting fired and all of those things? What is it that you can say as an ethicist to have us keep fighting the good fight for this?
First of all, thank you for sharing this. My mind is just trying to process the weight of what you've said, which is raising so many things, right? Also, like the keywords that we use in these kind of health reports, and that will then impact on diagnosis or services that people can access. I wish, you know what, as an ethicist, I would say that we need a lot of critical debates that look at this, right, at the social and ethical impact of these kind of processes. But I think the solutions then also are with people who actually look at how we train algorithms and how we analyze them and assess them and how they're working. And that goes beyond my expertise as an ethicist to people who actually know how to then counter this kind of bias and discrimination that goes into these automated processes, right? That I think is an expertise that is really needed, because as ethicists, we can analyze this and we can criticize it, but will it have impact on what's actually being done in practice? I think that needs someone with access to that practice and to access to the technology and how it's designed and who will be there and know how to fix it. And we need to fix that, right? We need to fix that, and we need some kind of like will to see this problem and be there. And I think that often what strikes me in these kind of cases is that we still need the human factor in debates about the technology and its design. That when you just automate something and feed it skewed results, it produces a lot of harm. And there needs to be some kind of audit that is done that actually checks what's happening. And does it produce the kind of results that we want, or does it produce something that's really harmful? And so maybe some of the responses to this is like having quality control, having audits of automated sort of systems regularly. And again, like when I was speaking about regulation, have this as a criteria or as a must. Because there's a lot of harm that is being done, and what often strikes me is that we really lack the quality control mechanisms and processes that they're lacking, that we always then arrive at some sort of disaster that could have been prevented. Like lots of it is preventable, and this is also what strikes me, that a lot of these results could have been prevented if we thought about it and if we actually had mechanisms in place that would require some kind of testing, and that would require also often testing, again, intersectionally, thinking about all the different groups that we need to check whether the technologies work for, not just assume that it will work for everyone from a very skewed sort of idea of who the target population is. So I would again end with we need regulation and we need quality control, and we need really careful quality control on intersectional approaches to health. And I don't know, this is probably not completely on ethicists. This is really on people who are in practice and who are policymakers and law and scholars, and also in tech design. So looking at you, who is in the room, who might be able to improve this, this is really needed. And thanks again for bringing it up.